and thank you for joining our Teaching for 21st Century webinar brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang. I am your host, Annie Cyrus. Please use the Q&A box on your screen if you have any questions, and I promise we will answer them as soon as a very special guest presentation is over. With that being said, it is my privilege to introduce our guest this evening, Mark Tapson. He is a Shellman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Hi, Mark.
Hello, Annie.
How are you doing?
Good so far. How about you?
I am doing great, thank you. We are all excited to hear your thoughts, so floor is yours.
All right, then. Well, thank you for that, and thanks to everyone who's joining us. I'm honored to be here to talk to you and with you this evening. When I was asked to do a webinar, I felt like there were a lot of potential topics to choose from to address. After all, we're facing a lot of serious issues in the world these days, so many that it can seem overwhelming, like somehow the history that we're living through is accelerating and out of control. We seem to be living out the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. So there are a lot of topics right now at the forefront of the news, like the fight for the election integrity laws in Georgia, or our collapsing southern border, or cancel culture, the trial of Derek Chauvin, and on and on. But I decided to stick with a topic that I've been writing and speaking about for a while now, the war on the family, because it's such a critical topic and it's really at the core of the Marxist left's agenda. The phrase war on the family might sound rather melodramatic, but I think it's appropriate because there most definitely is a concerted effort by the radical left to destroy the traditional Western conception of the nuclear family and to replace it with a collectivist vision of the family that's not really a family at all, but what Hillary Clinton would probably call a village. Remember, she wrote a book called It Takes a Village, in which she argued that what our children need is not so much a mother and a father, but vastly more government investment in programs to give children more of a cradle to grave safety net. Hillary later turned that book into an award-winning children's book, by the way, because the left always makes sure to target young readers with their propaganda. Anyway, the general idea is that for the left, the best way to raise our children is not within a tight-knit two-parent home, but within a collectivist support system and in the embrace of an all-caring, all-benevolent government. I'm going to be covering a lot of ground and touching on different topics like cultural Marxism, Hollywood, education, critical theory, and so on. So I hope I won't spread things too thin, but I hope to demonstrate that it's all connected. Okay, among the strategies for waging war on the family are breaking down our accepted understanding of man and woman, a sort of delegitimizing of the sexual binary of male and female, denigrating traditional sex roles, and in particular, demonizing and subverting traditional masculinity. And I'll talk more about that in just a bit. But of course, probably the most significant front right now in the war on the family is in the field of education, where the left is hell-bent on indoctrinating our children with values and a collectivist mindset that are at odds with those of the parents and grandparents to seduce the younger generation into the leftist worldview. And not just in colleges and universities, but in classrooms today, ranging all the way from pre-kindergarten through graduate school, we are witnessing an unprecedented surge of leftist indoctrination that is molding our youth not into students, but into social justice warriors that are utterly devoid of critical thinking skills, ignorant of their own history, tribalized by identity politics, and obsessed with uncovering racial biases in themselves and in others. The leftist educators and administrators who massively dominate that field are creating budding totalitarians who will eventually become not unlike the Red Guard of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, driven by a sort of a self-righteous and sometimes even violent zeal to correct and perfect society. Now, leftists would roll their eyes at this and call it just another right-wing conspiracy theory. They would insist disingenuously that they are not coming for your kids any more than they are coming for your guns. And of course, they are coming for our guns, just as they're coming for our kids. To demonstrate that, let me let me begin by reminding you of something you may have seen back in 2013. It was a network promo for MSNBC that featured Melissa Harris Perry, who at the time was the host of her own show on the network. The promo presents her seemingly talking off the cuff about children's education. And she says, and I quote, "We've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion that these are our children. We have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities," unquote. Okay, well, critics rightly jumped on this as evidence that the left is hostile to the sanctity of the nuclear family and has ideologically predatory designs on our kids. Harris Perry, in the face of this criticism, tried to backtrack, claiming that all she meant was we should all take responsibility collectively as a society for ensuring that our kids grow up in safe neighborhoods and in good schools. Well, that sounds great, because who doesn't want our kids to have safe neighborhoods and good schools? But that's not what she said. She explicitly stated that our children and society are better served if we break the private bonds of the traditional family model and adopt the collectivist view that kids should be shared by the entire community. In other words, it takes a village to raise our children. Now, why did MSNBC choose to promote itself with that kind of message? Because it was signaling to their progressive audience that Melissa Harris Perry and the network support their audience's forward-looking vision in which the old bourgeois ways of individualism and capitalism are cast off to pave the way for a socialist collectivist paradise. That is a central strategy straight from the mouth of Karl Marx, who openly called for the abolition of the family. For Marx, the bourgeois family structure was inextricably linked to private gain, as he put it. Both the family and private gain must vanish, in his words, to liberate humanity from its serfdom, because the family deprives the worker of revolutionary consciousness. His partner in crime, Friedrich Engels, wrote that when the proletariat revolts and transfers the means of production to common ownership, quote, "the single family ceases to be the economic unit of society, and the care and education of the children become a public affair. Society looks after all children alike," unquote. Gee, that sounds a lot like what Melissa Harris Perry was saying. Now, why is the family an obstacle to revolutionary consciousness? Because as the fundamental bond of humanity, it's the most formidable line of defense against totalitarian state control, which is the inevitable end of any attempt to create a collectivist state. So to undermine the family, the radical left has undertaken a decades-long campaign to denigrate marriage and motherhood, to obliterate gender distinctions, and to delegitimize traditional masculinity, and to indoctrinate younger generations into a new woke worldview that is irreconcilable with the capitalist Judeo-Christian value system of their parents and grandparents. Let me take a little aside here. Why is the emasculation of men crucial to this strategy? Because masculinity is the warrior spirit of the nuclear family. It is the dynamic, aggressive, unruly, and individualistic energy that drives men to build, explore, defend, and fight, to resist submission, to resist mediocrity, and to embrace the personal freedom and self-reliance of capitalism, unlike collectivist sheep who prefer the deceptively safe spaces of government control. So masculinity is a threat to tyranny that is not easily confronted head on. So men must be subverted and devitalized culturally in their roles as fathers and leaders and fighters. So as it always does, the radical left seeks to subvert these family bonds, to turn children against parents, and to seduce them to give their loyalty to the state. And when I talk about the radical left, I'm not talking about a fringe element. The radical left now is the mainstream Democratic Party. which now holds all the political power in this country. So the agenda that I'm talking about is central to today's Democrat Party, and it's accelerating now that they are in total political and cultural control of the country. One of the principal ways in which the left tries to seduce younger generations is, of course, through education, as I mentioned. In her webinar last week, Claire Lopez discussed some of the scary developments in the field of education, like the introduction of critical race theory and other social justice indoctrination. So I don't want to go too much over the ground she's already ably covered. But let me go quickly over how we got to this point. A half century ago, progressive activists realized that the overthrow of the establishment was most effectively brought about not through violent protest, but by the long march through the institutions, as it's called, particularly in the field of education. After all, children are the future, and the surest and most direct way to shape the future is to mold generations of impressionable young minds who are a captive audience for subversion and indoctrination. And this is why domestic terrorists like Barack Obama mentor Bill Ayers and his literal partner in crime, Bernardine Dohrn, it's why they abandoned bomb making for the Weather Underground and became respected, credentialed educators working primarily with children. Ayers earned 2 master's degrees in early childhood education and a doctorate in curriculum and instruction. And the law professor Dohrn is one of the founders of the Children and Family Justice Center at Northwestern University. Melissa Harris Perry, too, was a college educator. So this long march is, by and large, otherwise known as cultural Marxism. What is cultural Marxism? Very simply put, it is the application of Marxism not just to economics, where it does not work at all, witness Venezuela, for example, but to the culture, where it works exceedingly well. Cultural Marxism grew out of what's called critical theory that was developed in the 1930s and 40s by the so-called Frankfurt School of Intellectuals. It takes the oppressor versus oppressed paradigm of Marxism, and it expands it to apply not just to the working class, but to other groups that are supposedly marginalized under capitalism: Blacks, gays, women, transgenders, and so on. The Frankfurt School was vastly influential in academic circles. Its work is the basis for the whole proliferation of women's studies, gay studies, Black studies, whiteness studies, masculinity studies, and similar kinds of social justice programs that dominate university campuses today. The aim of critical theory is to relentlessly critique, as the name implies, every aspect of the social reality of the capitalist West, to identify all of its ills and its power imbalances, and to offer practical means for correcting those injustices. For the left, perfecting our unjust world requires burning the old flawed world to the ground in the cleansing fire of social justice wokeness, erasing everything that came before, our history and our heroes, our traditions and institutions, our worldview, our morality, everything. And when you throw postmodernism into the mix, critical theory even leads to the rejection of objective reality itself and the denial of universal truths. And so our so-called institutions of higher learning have churned out year after year, decade after decade, young students brainwashed into believing Western civilization is not a beacon of freedom and prosperity and progress, but the villain of history, the evil oppressor and exploiter of women, minorities, and non-Western cultures. These students think that America is exceptional only in the degree of its inherent racism, misogyny, and economic inequality. So from college, they have gone on to populate positions of control in society, from human resources departments to corporate boardrooms, to school administrations, to the news media, to Hollywood studios, and so on. And there they implement their social justice agendas, and they enforce their identity politics demands, and the culture is gradually steered away from traditional values and attitudes toward the collectivist aims of progressivism. But the Cultural Marxism in our schools isn't limited just to higher education, as I mentioned before. It begins now in pre-K. And the aim of progressive educators is not to pass down to our youth the incredible cultural and intellectual legacy of our civilization, or the accumulated wisdom and knowledge of the past. It's not to cultivate their individual potential as students and human beings. It's not even to develop their critical thinking skills, because all of that works against a revolutionary consciousness. Instead, their intent is to mold and mobilize social justice activists, to propagandize them on issues for political activism long before they enter college. A major example of this effort is the recent dissemination of the New York Times' 1619 project, which I think Claire Lopez talked about last week also. It's a work whose aim is to reset the founding date of the United States from 1776 to 1619, the year slaves were first brought to America's shores. The 1619 project argues that America was founded in racist oppression, not in freedom, thus discrediting our entire history and our very essence as a country. The conclusions of this program have been debunked by hundreds of serious historians, and its scholarship has been judged so shoddy that the National Association of Scholars has called for the Pulitzer Prize that was awarded to its lead writer to be rescinded, but too late, because the 1619 project is now part of a curriculum taught in more than 4,500 schools nationwide. And as if that weren't enough, Hollywood is going to help spread its corrosive cultural influence. Oprah Winfrey is backing a feature film based on the 1619 project, and the New York Times plans to develop more movies and TV shows from it as well. And while I'm on that, let me talk for a moment about the importance of the entertainment industry in this indoctrination and its effect on the family. The left has known for 60 years how vital pop culture is to their mission. When Barack Obama left the White House, did he just settle into his role as an elder statesman? No. He went to Netflix to sign a multi-million-dollar deal to produce social justice content for them. And that is just the tip of the iceberg of the left's surge into producing propaganda for networks like Netflix and Hulu and others, a lot of which is targeted at younger audiences, if not preteens and grade school children. In October, for example, last October, Black Lives Matter founder Patrisse Cullors signed a production deal with Warner Brothers to produce content including animation, scripted and unscripted projects, and also digital projects to be aired on streaming services and TV and film. In March, I think it was, Black Lives Matter activist and basketball blowhard LeBron James launched his own media empire with $100 million in investor backing to produce and distribute political content that was designed, as he put it, to move the culture. Last summer, NFL anthem protester Colin Kaepernick signed with the Walt Disney Company and ESPN to produce scripted and unscripted stories that deal with race and social injustice, including a documentary series about his own life. Netflix has also struck a deal with anti-racism racist Ibram X. Kendi, the best-selling author, to adapt 2 of his books into movies and children's programs. Sesame Street has announced that it's going to air a special episode teaching children how to be anti-racist, because to brainwash children against their parents, who mostly believe in Martin Luther King's dictum that we should judge each other by the content of our character instead of the color of our skin, it's vital to inculcate a racial consciousness in children as early as possible. So the reason the left floods money into showbiz projects like these instead of into political think tanks like the right does is because, unlike the right, they understand that culture is everything, that politics flows downstream from culture, as the late, great Andrew Breitbart was fond of pointing out. Okay, back to education. Our schools are being flooded by teachers' union-sanctioned curricula from Black Lives Matter, which was founded by self-declared trained Marxists, supposedly promoting racial equity. And by the way, if you're wondering why the word equity seems to have replaced equality, It's because equality is no longer a value that the left holds. Now they demand equity, which is present discrimination to correct past discrimination. So when you hear someone calling for equity, remember that what they mean runs directly counter to the original mission of the civil rights movement. And back to Black Lives Matter. Until recently, their mission statement included a call to, quote, disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, unquote. Now, when that portion of the mission statement began to catch people's attention and cause concern, it was scrubbed from their website. So you won't find it there now. An offshoot of critical theory is critical race theory, which has swept through the culture seemingly overnight, with best-selling race hustlers like Ibram X. Kendi, whom I mentioned earlier. He wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility and who is white herself. They assert that whiteness is irredeemably racist and that America's so-called systemic racism is an undeniable reality. Critical race theory is so polarizing that Kendi even claims that there is no such thing as being neutrally not racist. You are either racist or actively anti-racist. This critical race theory is metastasizing like a cancer in our schools. One example, in Virginia, Democrat Governor Ralph Northam is revamping Virginia's school curriculum all the way down to elementary school to incorporate a narrative of white oppression of Blacks and Native Americans. Similar narratives like this are being incorporated into schools all across the country, even religious schools. And there'll be no avoiding or opting out of this racial indoctrination in schools. My friend Larry Sand, president of the California Teachers Empowerment Network, has written about California legislation requiring all students to take an ethnic studies model curriculum in order to graduate, saying this curriculum is nothing more than a Marxist blueprint whose purpose is to indoctrinate California's children. You may also have heard recently that an ethnic studies curriculum is being implemented in which kids are encouraged to chant to the gods of the bloodthirsty Aztecs. And if you think that is just right-wing conspiracy theory, I invite you to look up the curriculum for yourself. This pernicious philosophy of critical race theory and other similar race-mongering programs is tearing our nation apart. It's not eradicating racism. It is creating racists on both sides of the color line. But of course, that's the point. The race agitators of cultural Marxism and critical race theory are not interested in ending racism, but in dismantling all the foundations and structures of Western civilization. And they are being aided and abetted by a progressive news media that has a vested interest in sowing discord, or as infamous progressive strategist Saul Alinsky put it, rubbing raw the resentments of the people. So again, the strategy is to indoctrinate the younger generation and turn it against its parents and their incorrect thinking. The upside of the COVID pandemic, if you could say there is one, is that forcing school closures and creating a new normal of remote learning is, I think, exposing some formerly naive parents to the disturbing degree of indoctrination that's going on in their kids' classes. An English teacher in Philadelphia, for example, wrote on Twitter last summer that he was concerned about the damage that parents might cause if they overheard his lessons on topics like gender and sexuality. And he said in his tweet, quote, "We'll never be quite sure who is overhearing the discourse. What does this do for our equity/inclusion work? If we are engaged in the messy work of destabilizing a kid's racism or homophobia or transphobia, how much do we want their classmates' parents piling on?" Unquote. And similarly, a school district in Tennessee was called out about the same time last year for asking parents to sign a form agreeing not to eavesdrop on their kids' virtual classes. And one homeschooling mom asked, well, what are they trying to hide? Well, what they're trying to hide is that they're teaching our kids propaganda that is intended to drive a wedge between the kids and their parents, to inculcate a set of secular, social justice, collectivist values that are directly opposed to the older generation's Judeo-Christian values and worldview. Progressive teachers do not believe parents are the legitimate or appropriate authorities of their own children. They believe their social justice obligation is to liberate students from their parents' outdated attitudes and to deprogram them. And if you think that sounds exaggerated or again like a conspiracy theory, just consider what an attorney for PBS was caught saying on tape a couple of months ago by the amazing investigators at Project Veritas. He said Trump supporters, quote, will be raising a generation of intolerant, horrible kids. So we need to go for all the Republican voters, and Homeland Security will take their children away and will put them into re-education camps, unquote. And he can say things like that because just like Melissa Harris Perry, he believes that children belong not to their parents, but to the state. And if the parents hold outdated, unwoke beliefs, then it's the state's responsibility to remove the children from that influence and make sure they are properly indoctrinated. People like this PBS attorney now feel empowered to say and do these kinds of things because the leftists created a culture in which conservatives are demonized as domestic terrorists and fascists whose children must be rescued from them and turned into social justice warriors. I could go on and on with a lot of similar examples. Our listeners no doubt have heard many of them themselves, but education and Hollywood aren't the only arenas in which the left is grooming children to become progressive. Another strategy is to normalize so-called gender fluidity and sexual perversion. One of the tactics underway across this country is drag queen story hour in libraries, in which sick grown men in gender-bending, sometimes literally demonic costuming, groom very young children toward gender confusion at best and sexual perversion at worst. It is outrageous that libraries endorse this, but mostly I blame the woke parents who bring their kids and think they're being open-minded and inclusive and tolerant by exposing their innocent children to this disturbing behavior. There was a recent Washington Post article on parenting that featured so-called experts advising parents on how to raise woke children from as early an age as possible, to instill in toddlers a racial consciousness so that from their earliest schooling, they will view each other through the distorted lens of racial suspicion and animosity. And also among those so-called experts were a drag queen duo who have written children's books, of course, about drag queens, and who predictably will soon have their own TV show, because there is no behavior so disturbing and satanic that Hollywood won't create a show to promote it. Now, there's a lot more to say about the things that I've touched on. I didn't even raise the issue of toxic masculinity, for example, which is a concept that is used to demonize and emasculate men. The war on the family encompasses a lot of aspects, but just to begin to bring today's webinar to a close and make room to take questions, let me state that it doesn't take a village to raise our children. It takes a family. It takes a mother and a father, because statistics overwhelmingly prove that broken homes spell doom for children in later life. It takes a culture that values and supports strong families. And for those of us who love our civilization and our liberty and our freedoms, restoring that kind of culture will require a long march of our own through the institutions that are now dominated by the left, or maybe better yet, a separate alternate culture of our own, which is a huge topic of its own. So what do we do about the radical left's agenda? Okay, first and foremost, push back. As it says in the book of Ephesians, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. Well, friends, the day of evil is here. It's time to stand our ground. Okay, so how do we push back? Well, first and foremost, speak the truth, regardless of the cost. Do not accept the left's propaganda that this country was founded on racism, that systemic racism is a thing, that whiteness is a thing, that a man can be a woman, that patriotism is white nationalism, that war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength, as Orwell said. Push back against those lies. The writer Theodore Dalrymple once wrote that the purpose of communist propaganda was not to persuade or to convince or inform, but to humiliate. Because when people are being told the most obvious lies and forced to keep silent about them, or they're forced to repeat the lies themselves, they lose their sense of integrity and dignity, and their ability to resist anything is eroded and eventually destroyed. A society of emasculated liars is easy to control, Dalrymple said. So speak the truth. It will inspire others to speak it also, because courage is contagious. And make sure your children and grandchildren see and hear you defending the true, the good, and the beautiful, and honoring the cultural heritage that the left wants to eradicate. On a perhaps more practical note, regarding the indoctrination of our children, band together with other parents or grandparents to flood PTA meetings and school board meetings with complaints and demands about the education of your kids. In the longer run, run for seats on the school board yourself or help your friends do it. In a shorter run, do whatever it takes to get your kids out of our hopelessly broken educational system and homeschool them. Or if they're already grown, offer to homeschool your grandchildren. Homeschooling is a daunting experience at first, but it is rewarding beyond measure to parent and child alike. And I believe it's a critical step these days to preserve the family against the radical left. My wife and I are blessed to be in a position to homeschool our kids. And I realize that's not possible for everybody. But I strongly recommend making every possible sacrifice in order to homeschool. Because if you don't, I don't even want to say odds are, I would say it is certain that you will lose your kids unless they're blessed to be in a private school that is committed to classical education. Only parents themselves can save their families from a predatory left. And once that bond is gone and the state gets its ideological claws into your kids, totalitarianism will follow as surely as night follows day. Don't be fooled by the radical left's pretense of compassion for the children. Make no mistake, the left wants to turn them against you and recruit the next generation into their collectivist vision. Don't let them. Okay, thank you for listening. I'm ready to take questions, I suppose, if anyone is still awake.
I can promise you, Mark, we are wide awake. That was some serious, scary information. I'm grateful that you are providing the information, but wow.
It's scary. Yes, it's very scary. And I have a vested interest in it because I have a lot of kids. I have a lot of little kids myself. And of course, we have friends with a lot of kids, and we see the difference between the kids that are in our homeschooling community and the kids that are not, the kids that are in public school. And it's very alarming. And I think it's really, as I mentioned at the outset, it's really at the core of the left's agenda, because the family has to be taken down. The family has to be dismantled as the last backstop against totalitarianism and tyranny. And so that's what's underway, is the indoctrination of our children, the emasculation of, we'll call it traditional masculinity, the denigration of motherhood, and all of those aspects, and then all the gender bending and gender fluidity agenda that's being pushed. It's a full-on assault, and it's very disturbing.
Absolutely agreed. I will start reading you the questions in 1 second, but I want to ask you a question myself, if that's all right.
Yes.
I heard everything that you said as far as what we can do, but here's a legal question. Is there any legal process? Is there any legal way for parents who have kids in the schools to fight back? Or are we out of all legal options?
I couldn't really expound on the legalities of things, but I can say that there are parents who are pushing back. They go to school board meetings and complain vociferously, and they also will write to teachers and school administrators and say, my kid brought home this critical race theory homework. I utterly disapprove. It's creating a false racial consciousness in my child. I saw a pretty dramatic video recently of a Black woman. I wish I could recall what school district she was in. I can't even remember what state at this point, but a Black woman confronted the school board and said that what they were being taught about race was completely opposed to the civil rights perception that she grew up with, which is that you judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. It's completely the opposite of that. Now it's completely based on the color of your skin. And she said they were turning her children against her, that they were arguing with her in her own home about this stuff. And she was extremely upset about it. And of course, the school board members, or at least the school board, I guess the main speaker of the school board basically shouted her down, saying he completely disagreed with her, that the school board was utterly committed to equity. And there's that word again, equity. When they start shouting at you that they are committed to equity, that's not equality. That's not what they mean. They mean they are committed to discrimination. It's just a different kind of discrimination. It's the discrimination that advances the left's victimhood narrative. So anyway, so even, it's not just white people complaining about, my children are being taught about whiteness and all this. It's parents of all backgrounds and colors who are saying, what you're teaching my child is warping them about race.
That's understandable. Okay, let me go ahead and start reading you the questions from audience. Starting here says, can any of this indoctrination be stopped by political or religious means, or does it have to be a bottom-up approach by parents?
Good question. I mean, I think it has to be both. I think it mostly has to be bottom-up. But politicians are, I think Ron DeSantis, for example, the Florida governor, has introduced legislation to ban critical race theory from being taught in schools. So there are politicians who are starting to recognize this. And you will remember that former President Trump banned critical race theory from being taught in government programs. And of course, he was slammed for that as being racist. But that's what you're going to get no matter what you do from the left. But there are politicians who recognize the threat and who are starting to take steps. So it can be approached politically, but it's going to be an uphill battle all the way, because it has already crept throughout our schools and throughout corporate culture. Woke corporate culture is just off the deep end leftist now, with all of their virtue signaling, and they're hurling millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars at Black Lives Matter and other anti-race organizations, anti-racist organizations. And so it's now so deeply embedded in the culture that it's going to be hard to root out, because the left owns the culture. So that's going to take, as I mentioned briefly in my talk about a parallel alternate culture, I think we need the ground up construction of a parallel culture in this country. And that's a big topic. And I don't have all the answers about that, but it's got to be from the ground up and political, but as I said, it's going to be an uphill battle.
Let me ask you this, Mark. They call themselves the anti-racism groups, right? I mean, how are you going to end racism? How are you going to be anti-racism when, for example, Coca-Cola released an educational pamphlet telling the employees to be less white? How does that logic work?
The so-called logic is, well, there's not really a lot of logic. I mean, and that's part of the postmodernism of this, is that, postmodernism posits that there really are no universal truths, and there's no, everybody has my truth and your truth and all that, but there's really no obvious logic behind it. But the left's logic goes this way. It's not race. You're only racist if you are in a position of power to implement your racism. In other words, blacks cannot, or other minorities cannot be racist because they don't have the political and social and cultural power to impose their racist attitudes on other people. Whites do. That's the logic, is that whites are the oppressors. They're the only ones who can be racist, because they equate racism. They say that racism is prejudice plus power. So what seems like obvious racism to us is not racism to them. I've had people tell me on social media, for example, they've said, "You've got it all wrong. Blacks can't be racist." Well, they certainly can, but by the left's, I mean, anyone can be. But by the left's logic, they can't be, because they do not have the political power. Of course, when they were in power, when Barack Obama was in office for 8 years, they didn't seem to do anything about so-called systemic racism or any of the rest of it. But it's that is the purported logic, is that only whites have the power to be racist. And so criticizing whiteness, criticizing whites is not racist. It's part of, it's anti-racism. It's part of healing us, of leading us out of our whiteness and helping us to be allies against racism.
So basically, they're going to end the systemic racism by cultural genocide of white people.
That's, I mean, they certainly wouldn't openly say that, but they do say that whites are irredeemably racist, that whiteness is irredeemable, and that all whites can ever hope to do is do the hard daily work of combating their whiteness and their inherent biases and their white privilege. So it's never ending. But that's, you asked at the beginning of your question, how are we ever going to end racism? But that's not the point. That's not the point for the left. They have to maintain this constant struggle of anti-racism, because if our society ever does reach the point where we judge people, and we were getting there, by the color, by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, then that disempowers the left completely. They have to have the victim narrative. They have to have they have to have the worldview that everything is viewed through the lens of oppressor and oppressed, and power and powerlessness. That's the way that the left seizes and controls and maintains power.
Got it. Okay, here's another question from our audience. The end goal is communism, for the left to control the means of production. But I have always been confused about why businesses cave into the demands by the left. Can they ever organize against the self-destructive of their own interests? And I think that question came in when you were talking about Hollywood and all these production companies giving into Black Lives Matter and, the basketball players and all that.
This is partly the result of decades of indoctrination. And I mentioned in the talk about how the graduates of this indoctrination go on to occupy positions of power in society, like especially human resources departments, education, corporate boardrooms. So now corporate America is loaded with all of these virtue signaling people who may be billionaires, but they are leftists at heart. And of course, the real elites, the really wealthy elites, can afford to insulate themselves from the effects of their own policies. They can shield themselves from whatever happens economically to the rest of the country. But who was it? Was it Lenin? Or I think it was Lenin who said that communists would sell capitalists the noose that they would use to hang themselves. Or I think I just mangled that. But it was essentially that communists would undermine capitalists by their own, through their own worldview, I guess. And that's what's happening. So we'll see what happens. We'll see how far this can go economically before things start to collapse in some ways. And we become like a true socialist or communist culture where we're divided between the impoverished masses and a ridiculously wealthy elite upper stratum.
Oh boy. Why isn't the school curriculum under the control of elected politicians, not just the school board members? And if it is, why don't they take control away from education bureaucrats?
You mean like, why don't politicians take it out of the hands of school boards? Well, I guess school boards, I mean, I'm not quite sure how that would work, but I think, school boards are also duly elected people, I believe. And so that's why I mentioned that it's urgent that people who care about this kind of thing get on school boards, try to get on school boards anyway, and help sway things. I think education, I think education is generally a state issue and not a federal issue. So politically speaking, I think it just comes down to the micro as opposed to the macro politically. So it's got to start with the school boards, I guess. But then you've got, you have governors like Governor Newsom in California who support this kind of leftist curriculum. So he's certainly not going to take it out of the hands of the left-leaning school boards now. So politically, maybe if you've got someone in office like Ron DeSantis in Florida, then that helps. But generally, it's got to start locally with the school boards.
Yeah, it seems like no matter how we look at it, your suggestion is the best, just homeschool. Because you never know who's in power. I mean, let's say even if if it was under federal government control, right now we had Biden administration controlling the schools. That wouldn't be any better, right?
I'm a huge believer in homeschooling. It is a daunting thing to get involved with because if you start from scratch and know nothing about it, and we've had some friends who don't know anything about it, and they find out that we homeschool, or not just friends, but people we meet, and they have this very old-fashioned kind of stereotyped impression of homeschooling that, it's that we are forcing our children to memorize the Old Testament, chained in the basement somewhere or something, and we're only teaching them about the Bible. It's incredibly social, and studies show that homeschooled kids are better educated and better socialized than public school kids. You can see the difference. All you have to do is put homeschool kids next to public school kids in a social setting, and you can see the difference immediately. As I mentioned, I'm really blessed to be able to work from home, and my wife and I are 100% committed to homeschooling. And so it's working out for us. Not everybody can do that, but I think it's the only way to save your kids. I really believe that our public schools are hopelessly broken, all the way from preschool to graduate school. So I think it's a necessity in the short run to get your kids out of school. And the pandemic has forced a lot of parents to do that. And so there's been a big boom in homeschooling. A lot of people are finding out, hey, we could make this work, and it's better for our kids, et cetera. My biggest concern about that is that it draws more attention to homeschooling, and that governments now and the left are going to put extra pressure on homeschoolers which they're already doing actually, because they're seeing that parents might be taking the education into their own hands.
That is very, very understandable. Okay, we do have time to squeeze one more question in there, so let me do my best. One way that I preserve the old culture is by passing around very old books with normal old ideas, which have been banned and replaced by woke ideology in schools and libraries, will last for a very long time before they fall apart. What are your thoughts on that method?
I'm very glad that the questioner brought that up, because I've been talking about this lately. Get all the books that you can find. Go to bookstores and buy them now. And I'm not talking about ebooks. I buy a lot of ebooks. I find them very useful in certain ways, but I urge everybody to start going out and collecting books like never before, and especially pick up classics. Go get the classics, because as the questioner mentioned, gradually cancel culture is going to get to all these things. And I guarantee you, more and more books, I guarantee you we're going to reach a point where I don't want to bring up the specter of Fahrenheit 451 too soon, but I guarantee you we will reach a point where you will need to hide the fact that you have these books at home, but get them and start collecting them. Now, I'm a big book fanatic anyway, so I already have lots of books, but I've made a special effort to go fill some gaps in books that I think are going to be canceled down the line. Look, if Dr. Seuss can be canceled, if Captain Underpants, there's a children's series of books called Captain Underpants. Well, he's been canceled recently because of some what they called how did they put it? Passive racism in the books. So every day some other author is being canceled. The classics like Shakespeare, all these dead white males that the progressives despise, they're going to be canceled. Find their books and hide them at home if you have to, because there will come a time when you will have to keep it a secret that you have these books at home. I guarantee it.
Okay, very last question for all of our audience who do not know where to find you to get more information. Where do they go and how do they find you?
Yes, I recently more or less abandoned social media. So I am not on Twitter anymore. I'm barely on Facebook. My Instagram page is private. So the best way to contact me or to keep up with what I do is just to go to marktapson.com. There's not much happening there except that I post my articles, but I'm about to revamp that website into something a lot more user-friendly and interesting. So I would just say go to marktapson.com. You can also check out frontpagemag.com, where I regularly write and where a lot of brilliant other writers, not other brilliant writers, I'm not including myself in that, I'm just saying other writers who are brilliant contribute. So frontpagemag.com.
Fantastic. And even though you are not going to admit to it, I will. You are a brilliant writer. So I encourage everyone to check out Mark Tapson's website. Mark, thank you so much. It is always a pleasure to hear all of your brilliant thoughts. And thanks for educating us tonight. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And to our audience who stayed with us until now, we appreciate you very much. Remember, these webinars are brought to you by David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang for free. So if you'd like to support these webinars, all you got to do is go to frontpagemag.com and consider making a 100% tax-deductible donation. With that being said, stay safe and goodbye.